Hi guys, welcome to week 3. We are, I guess, like almost a third of the way through class. Doesn't really feel like we've done that much, but I feel like we kind of have at the same time. I don't know how you guys are feeling. Anyway, this week I want you to pick 3 readings, read them, do a discussion board, do a response paragraph. And this video is pretty much going to be really short and kind of walk you through some of the readings that we're going to look at. You can pick which ones you're interested in. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the most important lessons that I want you to go over and kind of like what's going on in Blackboard this week. And that's kind of it. Okay, so the first text that you can pick to talk about, to read and to analyze. And actually, before I preface this, or before I talk about this, let me preface it with a lot of the texts that we're looking at this week are nonfiction and poetry. So we don't have fiction this week. We just have nonfiction and poetry. So the first text is 1492 by Emma Lazarus, and Emma Lazarus is Jewish and talks a lot about sort of like the Jewish mindset and some of the struggles that Jewish people have faced in Europe. And this is like 1492 kind of talks about that. But then of course also in The New World, which is sort of like a nod to this poem. So like if you've ever heard the little jingle, 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, she's sort of talking about that. She's talking about if the Jewish people did not convert to Catholicism, then they were sort of like cast out from Spain. And so where did they go? Well, there's this new world because Christopher Columbus has discovered it on his route to find the Indias. Our textbook says it's a really short poem, but it has a lot of imagery and has a lot of nods to very historical elements that you're probably very familiar with. From our textbook, Lazarus's poetry combines free-flowing, often powerful imagery with a careful attention to poetic form. So maybe some of you are interested in analyzing poetic form for this assignment, and that's fine. I don't think have I said this before? Poetry's not my favorite. This poem's not my favorite, but it gives us, if we're thinking back to our Unit 1 reading and we're talking about like voices, we've looked at in week 1, we kind of looked at texts that reflected the feeling, like the themes of the time period, the central feelings within literature of the time period. Last week, we looked at women's voices and feminism and things like that. And then this week, we're looking at marginalized voices. So we're like, even though I'm not a huge fan of this poem, I'm trying to fit in as many of these other voices that I can. So we have this poem. We also have Impressions of an Indian Childhood, and this is just 3 really short chapters from Zit Khalassa's autobiography. So this is nonfiction. And these 3 chapters kind of like walk us through her progress or her beginnings of assimilating into like white culture. So it starts with sort of her on what I'm guessing is the reservation, where she talks about being in the wigwam with her mother and things like that, and then to her decision to go to boarding school in, I believe, Massachusetts, and just kind of like how she felt about that day when she left her mom in order to go to boarding school. That's chapter 7. So we get sort of this progression here. Our textbook says at the age of 8, Zit Khalassa declared her intention to learn the white man's ways, or as she puts it, she wanted to taste the big red apples missionaries promised Indian children if they would attend boarding school. And so it's really about that. It's about her young life. You get her perspective as a child. I think it's really, it's an easy read. I think, like, for me, poetry is really challenging. So for me, this is much easier than reading poetry. It's really short. It's 5 pages. But it is almost like it's a story. It's obviously not, it's not fiction, but it's a story of her, and I think it's nice. I really like it. So I'd encourage you guys to check that one out too. And so we have our marginalized Jewish voice, we have our marginalized Native American voice, and then we also have a lot of, like, I mean, we're in the very recent post-Civil War time period when all these things have been written. So of course we have to have our Black voices, and our discussions of, like, okay, well, what do we do now? How is America changing because slavery is not a thing anymore? Like, what do we do? So we have Booker T. Washington, who wrote Up From Slavery, which is a whole book, but we're just going to read chapter XIV 14. It's about 8 pages. And so this is an address. So this is nonfiction as well. It's an address that he wrote to, I think he was at, like, in Atlanta. He was at a Southern Trade Fair on opening day, and he's basically talking about, like, he's trying to inspire integration. He's trying to, which is interesting because a lot of people have criticized him, to say that he really was, like, sort of okay with segregation, because we hadn't really had all of those conversations yet in America about segregation. Washington is basically saying to he goes through, like, this parable about a shipwreck or being on a boat or something like that. And he basically says that, well, I want you to, talking to his Black audience, I want you to focus on what you're good at. And all of his Black audience members would, possibly / probably, it depends on where they lived, but have been recent, this is probably why it's called Up From Slavery, been recently removed from slavery. And so what do? Well, they're good at, because they've been forced to be good at, like, manual labor, right? So he's telling his Black audience to just excel at the level that you're at, and don't try to get jobs that are stereotypically white in this time period. And obviously today we can see how that's problematic. But at the time, he was praised a lot for these ideas. He talks to his white audience members. Like, he's not just talking to Black Americans, he's talking to white Americans too. And he's saying, like, you guys need to support Black Americans at the stage that they're at. This should be he's trying to promote peace, which is great, but he's doing it in a way that got a lot of criticism, particularly not necessarily during the time period that he wrote it, because I think the mindset just wasn't there yet, but particularly a few years after, maybe a few decades after he wrote it. Our textbook says, in Up From Slavery, Washington proposed a middle ground wherein African Americans would raise themselves by individual effort, and white Americans would appreciate the efforts being made and judge accordingly. So it's still presenting almost like a hierarchy, but again, I don't think our national consciousness was obviously to where we are today, which is not to say that we've come super far. So we're also reading a few chapters from The Souls of Black Folk by Du Bois. I never really thought about how to say that. Is the S silent or not? And so Forethought is basically him just kind of saying, hey, here's what's in my whole entire book. Chapter 1, he goes into the specifics of what he calls, like, what it's like to be a problem. So he recognizes that and he recounts a story of himself as a child, in school, and he recognizes that he is an other, right? So we're going to use this word a lot, that he is an other, that he is marginalized, that he's not part of the dominant culture, and he kind of just talks about what it's like to feel that way. And then in chapter 3, so we're going to skip chapter 2. In chapter 3, he responds to Booker T. Washington's ideas. So I think if you're going to read this one, I would definitely encourage you to read Booker T. Washington, because you're really going to have a better understanding of what he's saying in chapter 3. He's responding, and I put it nicely, but he's really disagreeing with. So he's discussing sort of the danger of holding Washington's ideas like basically saying he's wrong. And both of these men end up kind of being like opposing in their philosophies and in their ideals. He criticizes Washington for his comments on kind of keeping Black Americans down. And he says that, what was I going to say? I forgot. Okay. So our textbook says, I'll get to it eventually. The Souls of Black Folk combines autobiography, social science, political commentary, musicology, which is interesting. As a side note, he has a couple of like little blurbs from songs in what we're going to read. Musicology and even fiction to explore the implications of its dramatic and prophetic announcement that, according to Du Bois, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. That's what he says. And so he's really kind of, talking a lot about, I think essentially his goal is to respond in a way to Washington's ideas and offer an alternative, because he doesn't agree with Washington's sort of gentler approach to post-slavery. We're also going to read 2 poems by Paul Laurence Dunbar. I mean, obviously you pick the three you want to read, so you might not end up reading both of them. An antebellum sermon is a lot longer than We Wear the Mask, but it's only 2 pages. This poem you really have to read. It's written in the vernacular of a pre-Civil War, so antebellum, pre-Civil War era. It's written in the vernacular of like a preacher, a slave preacher. And so you have this like, some people have criticized it as very stereotypical, picture, I guess, like the stereotype of a Black church. And that's the vernacular that it's written in. The spelling that Dunbar is using is like that as well. But it's actually really fun to read. And yeah, maybe I shouldn't say that, but I think that if you read it how it's supposed to sound and you don't try to change the language, you're going to get more out of it. Dunbar is, I think, artistically using this vernacular to kind of allude. I mean, he obviously is writing this. The speaker of the poem is a sermon, a preacher, giving a sermon and sort of talking a lot about freedom and Moses and, set my people free, let my people go, that kind of discussion. So I'll be really interested to see how you guys interpret this poem in the discussion board. And then from our textbook, though Dunbar was celebrated by Black and white literary leaders in his own time, he was later criticized in the 1920s by Harlem Renaissance writers who saw him as catering to a white audience with stereotyped Black folk elements and dialect. And I think that what our textbook means here is just like, sometimes if you're too entertaining, it's like that belief. And in the Harlem Renaissance, we're going to get to that in Unit 2, but it's like this belief that sometimes white people of the time felt like Black people were just there for their own entertainment. So that was sort of, I think, the criticism of the Harlem Renaissance writers. And I think we'll see that in Unit 2. So keep this in mind. If you're gonna be interested in learning more about Harlem Renaissance, I would definitely encourage you to read this particular poem. And then We Wear the Mask is extremely short. It says a page. It's not even a page. It's not even half a page. Same author, Paul Laurence Dunbar. Our textbook says, as he wrote in his poem, Dunbar used his pen to mouth with myriad subtleties the many challenges facing African Americans in his time. And really, that's the case with this poem. I mean, you can interpret it how you will, but I really think that it reflects a lot of the themes that our other Black voices are writing about. And y'all, there's so many in the textbook. Like, if this isn't enough for you, there's a lot of other authors to read who are going to present new voices, and there's female Black authors that you can read as well. But in this poem, I think really he's writing about this, something that one of our other authors calls double consciousness. Is essentially this idea that Black Americans had who they were as individuals, but then they also had this other consciousness, and I'm paraphrasing certainly, that they had to, I guess, kind of see themselves through white people's eyes and look at themselves as if they were less than themselves. And I think that this poem reflects that double consciousness concept. So those are our 6 readings. I think that they're all heavy. Probably the least heaviest are the first 2. But I mean, post-Civil War is heavy stuff. So our discussion board, definitely keep everything text-based this week, y'all. And there's a lot of things that we could relate to contemporary times. But for the discussion boards, just focus on the text. Let's analyze the text, what's happening in the text. How can we read the text? How can we read into what the authors are saying? So keep that in mind as we're talking about it this week. So I'm going to minimize this and show you some things in week 3. If I'm going into the lessons that I want you to study, there's 5 of them. Vocabulary, as always, I'm going to talk to you guys about effective quotations. So when you're quoting your text, like, what types of lead-in phrases do you need to have? What about punctuation? How am I supposed to punctuate the end of my citations and quotations, and in the middle of quotes, and all sorts of things, incorporating quotes. I always get these lessons from Norton, and I took out some. They had sort of this table. You'll see one table in effective quotation, but there's another one in there that if you did link, or if you do decide to link to the actual website, so like if you chose to click on Norton, under section number 1, they had this other table that talked about like examples of ineffective quoting that I don't particularly agree with. I think that their examples are still good. You guys are not like in your senior year of literary theory or going into grad school for literary criticism or literature yet. Maybe that's your plan or whatever, but I think starting small is fine. So don't worry too much. I think that they're examples. If you see that first chart, if you go into the website, their examples are not very helpful. So just ignore that part. Let's see what else. So in addition to vocabulary and effective quotation, we'll talk really quickly about verb tense, present tense. But I think what you guys will be most interested in this week in terms of the lessons is the introduction to the final essay lesson. And so if you click in here, I'm going to give you a couple of things. So first, I'm going to link you to the assignment that details like what you're going to write for this essay. And as a reminder, the essay is not due until week 10, so you should be in the very early stages of figuring out what you want to write about. And then I link you to the rubric. So how will this essay be graded? It's very basic. This links you back to the final essay assignment sheet if you want to go back there. And then I just kind of have the self-assessment for this one is you ask me some questions just in case you're uncertain or unclear. So I want you to look at this. I want you guys all to make sure that you look at this assignment, and if you have questions, let me know. Do not wait until week 10 to try and figure this out. It's very open. You're able to analyze any of the texts that we have read this semester, including texts we haven't even touched on yet. We're just in Unit 1. You can pull from Unit 2. You can pull from Unit 3. If there's multiple texts that correlate that you wanted to talk about, you could email me and ask for permission to do that. Of course, I would tell you that that's fine. And so really, I just want you to get your bearings for what this final essay is going to be. And then the other most important lesson to review is literary criticism and theory, which is very complicated. And I only cover some of the more popular ones. There are other literary criticisms theories out there, like eco-criticism and modernism and postmodernism. And I think we're past postmodernism today, so there's other things and ways that we can interpret text, new criticism, new historicism, all sorts of things. I mean, historicism isn't even in here. And so there are definitely dozens of ways that you can interpret a text, and some of this stuff is really confusing. Like even for me, I've studied this in grad school, and I still get really confused when I read words like semiotic and symbolic, and what the heck does that even mean? And so if you have a question about anything that you're reading, if you're like, I really don't understand what you said when you wrote blah, 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 email me or message me on the Remind app. I will try and clarify my best for you, and if I can't, I will try and link you to some more helpful resources. I'm probably going to use YouTube to do that. So if you're like, well, I don't want to talk to her, so you could always try and Google it on YouTube, but just be careful, because some people who don't know what they're talking about will try and explain things to you that will either be wrong or make you even more confused. Essentially, with this essay, you can interpret a text however you want to interpret it. I want you to know how you're interpreting your text. Are you looking at it through a feminist lens? Are you looking at it through Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory? Are you looking at it through a Marxist perspective? Because that's going to help you focus your analysis, and that's really, really important. There's a fly in here. And so anyway, you have a lot of room. You have a lot of wiggle room with this assignment, but you want to know about literary criticism and theory. I can't let you leave this class without us talking about it. All right, y'all. What else do you want to do this week? And I'm like, oh, this video is going to be so short, and it's not. You have another close reading response paragraph. I am going to read through those this week and give you some video feedback, and it might not be until Sunday. Got a lot going on. And then do another discussion board, which I will make a video talking about all of it and then grade pretty strictly on those again. Okay, y'all, I think that covers everything. If there's anything that you have questions about or anything you couldn't hear because of me mumbling, please don't hesitate to email me and I will clarify for you. Otherwise, happy week 3, happy June, happy writing, happy reading, happy all the happy things.